I'm going to start by going all the way back to we're on number 307. I'm going to go back to 237 because of just this little bit of information that I found. 237 included this story that Master said, the reason Buddhism failed in India was because of laxity in the rule of non-communication between monks and nuns. Evils arose from that freedom, and Buddhism lost its power. And then he says, this whole section is about monastics. Let's see, where has he said it? He said, if I ever find the ladies and the men mixing together in this place, Master said, meaning Mount Washington, then no matter where I am in space, I shall return and I shall blast this organization out of existence, which seems like very strong words. And then he goes on and talks about Buddhism. And I've heard Swami say that, and I've read it in this book many different times. And of course, that has to be understood in context, and you can go back to whatever class number it was when I did number 237. Yeah, 59 is when it was. But I've just read that over and over again, and it in different contexts, and it's always seemed a little odd to me. Then I was reading a book about Ramakrishna, and the author Ramakrishna was the avatar of the 1800s who lived in Dakshineshwar near Calcutta. And this book was making a tremendous effort to explain the consciousness of a great master. And so they included this statement that, let's see, avatars know what will happen, but often they do it anyway, if God prompts them to do it, even if results are not going to turn out well. And then the example he uses was that Buddha gave sannyas to his aunt Gautami when it was not acceptable for females to become sannyasis, even though he knew it would lead to pollution in the order and that the order would become weakened because of it. So it's presumably that Master was referring, by his statement about Buddhism and the whole thing, he was referring to something that is a well-known story in the story of Buddhism. Implied in here, without my looking up the whole thing, that there were no female sannyasis at that time, and then Buddha decided to initiate this woman. And then I'm sure the rules and the relationships were complicated, and as a result, the integrity of the order was compromised. So he just mentions it, Buddhism was polluted because this happens. And then it's referred to in another book as if everybody knew the whole story. So since I never did, I thought a lot of other people might not either, and might understand sort of what the force of Master's statement was, that there must be a whole cycle that's related to that. And in the Ramakrishna book, he was just saying Buddha knew what he was doing, but he did it anyway, because it was just part of the cycle that had to take place. In the life of Krishna, there's the whole story about how his army is finally defeated, and Krishna leads them into the battle in which he knows they're all going to be annihilated, because he knows that it's time for them to be annihilated. So he just carries it on. We have from our human perspective, we just pick things up very differently.
Was this referring to the fact that in effect, the nuns weren't separated from the monks, so they intermingled? Is that what
Are we talking about Buddhism?
Yeah, for Buddhism?
I have no idea.
Oh, okay.
I just thought it was an interesting piece.
Yeah, because obviously there were, obviously at SRF there were nuns, but they were separated from the men.
But the point that the context of the story was Master saying it was very important to maintain that. The reason Master mentioned Buddhism is because he was talking about the importance of maintaining that separation within SRF. And that was just an extra piece about the reference to Buddhism, which had always seemed so strange to me. But when you just imagining, which I can't fill it all out, that Buddha himself launched what became the difficulty for Buddhism by imposing his aunt on the whole situation. Who knows what kind of a woman she was? And then it was just that there's always many other stories behind the stories. And since I had wondered about that one so many times when I came across it, I thought it was worth mentioning. And that's all I have to say. I can't add any more to it. I suppose one could research it, but I wasn't motivated to do so. Okay, can I go on? Number 307. Sometimes I, Walter, that's how Swami Kriyananda refers to himself, because Walter is what Master called him. His English last name was Walters, Donald Walters. Sometimes I, Walter, as the man in charge of the monks, accepted applicants mainly because it pained me to have to refuse anyone. Carol Jolliffe, Carol is a man's name in this context, Carol Jolliffe was one such person. Though I accepted him for monastic training, I knew he was not suited to our way of life. He practically exuded worldly attitudes. I saw, however, that he sincerely wanted to change. The Master's comment to me later was, "I'm going to have to give you intuition." It is interesting to note that my intuition in these matters did improve markedly after he said those words. Months later, the Master was in his car getting ready to go to see Sister Gyanamata for the last time. Carol was standing nearby. Seeing him, the Master paused to compliment him on the effort he had been making. "How much you have changed," he remarked. "I left it up to your own will. But see, isn't it much easier really to be good than bad? When one is bad, he is always afraid. When one is good, on the other hand, he is afraid of nothing and no one. The very gods then have to watch out, as the saying is, for the Lord himself is on his side. Just see how much better it is to live for God. You yourself know that you are happier." You know, there's more to this saying, but I'm going to stop here for a moment. You know, we have this incredibly false impression about how a master works with us. And one of the things this particular book has done more than any other is because Swamiji has been so informal in the stories that he's represented here and so on, you really get a very casual attitude about Master. And so you think that sort of you put yourself under the training of a guru and he takes over your life. But here he just says to this man, "I just left it to you." And here's a fellow who apparently had a lot to learn, but I just left it to you to see what you would do. In another completely unrelated context, Swami Kriyananda said, in terms of Ananda and our qualifications for people being members, this applies more at Ananda village where it's a residential scene with limited space, and so you have to pass over higher hurdles to become a member up there. And Swami said, don't spell it out too clearly what people are supposed to do, because if they know exactly what's expected of them, he said, they'll just do it. And you won't necessarily have any idea who people really are. He said, far better just to leave people alone and watch what they do, because then you'll find out whether people are suited for the life or not. So this man wasn't suited, as it turned out, but Master just left him alone. He'd had the good karma to get there, and he'd had the good karma to have Swamiji let him in. So he just decided to wait and see what Master was going to do about it. I mean, what he was going to do about it. And he just said so simply, you're happier when you're good, because when you're bad, you always have to be afraid. And in the end, Master writes in one of his Whispers prayers, he said, it's not enough to be good merely because it's your habit to be good. He said, you have to be good because it's it's spontaneous within you that you know that that's where true happiness lies. When he says it's your habit to be good, what that implies is not necessarily that it's a sincerely motivated action. A lot of times when you go through school and so on like that, you're a good student and you behave well, but it isn't necessarily that you've really integrated that behavior into yourself. You're just in the habit of doing it. And a lot of times people become adults and they're just in the habit of behaving the way the family or the society or the church expected them to do so. But it isn't really something that is actually become part of their own nature. And the way things become part of your own nature, it's very simple. We do what makes us happy. And if it makes us happy, genuinely happy inside, we don't have to be trained away from it. When I became a vegetarian, it wasn't like I had to discipline myself. I just simply totally lost interest in eating any other way. And for some people, it was a tapasya to have to constantly repudiate. But I just felt better, so I did it. It wasn't even a thought. It was just the way things were. And that's how we need to become about our righteous attitudes and our divine attitudes. They just need to be so integral to our nature, because to do otherwise makes us feel uncomfortable. And that's when you are really secure on the spiritual path, when you simply couldn't behave differently. I read a really amazing story. It came out of the Second World War in France, and the man had been a resistance fighter, but he was captured by the Gestapo, and he was sent into one of the camps. But he wasn't Jewish, he was there as a political prisoner. But he became conscious of the fact that the only salvation in that situation that he could see was to be absolutely, he didn't use the word dharmic, but that was what he meant. Everything he did had to be absolutely scrupulously honest, because he saw that the enemy was lies and deceit. And the enemy was not really the people who had incarcerated him, or even the fact that he was incarcerated. The enemy was wrong behavior. And so he realized the only antidote to wrong behavior was right behavior. So he had a girlfriend, and somehow or another the girlfriend actually traded sex for his freedom by sleeping with some man who had the authority to let him free. So he was released, but then he was with his girlfriend, and it gradually came out what she had done to get him free. And when he realized that, he turned himself back into the prison. Now, I mean, that was really quite an action, because he just felt like freedom wasn't the point. He had to remain absolutely honorable. I mean, can you imagine what the scene was between them? But he couldn't accept his freedom on those terms. It had to come in another way. Now, I'd like to tell you the end of the story, but I don't know if I know it. But I think he lived to tell the story, so I suppose that's something. Yeah, but it was really interesting about the power of that. But he knew it inside himself, that nothing good was going to come from wrong action. Where there's dharma, there's victory. And there comes a point for all of us, and we can point to certain qualities in our life already that we simply know we simply can't do it. Just can't be done. We don't know how severely we're going to be tested and how strong we'd be. There was another story just about dharma, because I'm talking about it. At a certain point in the late 80s, Swami Kriyananda started writing what we called the secrets books, which are these little books, secrets of happiness, secrets of love, secrets of peace of mind, secrets of meditation. And oddly enough, when he first started writing those, it was actually a new concept in the New Age thought field, so to speak, to make little books of aphorisms that were our kinds of thinking. So it was a big financial success for us, and we were selling quite a lot of those books. And one of our salesmen, Danny was his name, he went to the American Booksellers Association, which at that time was how the whole industry communicated with itself. And what was the equivalent of Costco, which was then called Price Club, wanted to sell those books in their stores. It would have been a huge order for us, and we needed the money. But they demanded an exclusive, which meant we'd have to break our contracts with other distributors. And there was one distributor in particular with whom we'd had a very long relationship, and our success with this book was, of course, helping them a great deal. And we had a contract with them. So Danny wasn't quite sure what he should do, and they'd been friends to us. They had become friends. It was more than business with them. And so he started asking the advice of various other professionals in the industry. And every single one of them, as soon as he proposed the dilemma, they said, how much money is involved? And after the third person said that to him, Danny realized that if there was enough money involved, you should sell your integrity. If they pay you enough, sell it. And when he realized that that was the question, he realized we just couldn't do it. Because this company too had been counting on all these sales, and if we just pulled it because we got a better offer over here, then how could we treat our friends that way? So we didn't take it. Where there's Dharma, there's victory. So we need to gradually integrate these things so we don't even have to stop and ask. But that was a good story for Ananda. The story of the man in the concentration camp is really breathtaking. But if we know it inside, we'll just behave accordingly. So that's what Master just says to this man. He knows that this is the best also that he can offer him. Well, he's not really going to be a good monk. But you look, when you're good, you're happier, aren't you? So that's quite a strong thought to be planted in your mind by a God-realized master. And then every time you misbehave and you start watching all the anxiety that follows afterwards, you'll begin to sort of weigh those words. Yeah. And then Master goes on to say, everything is for God anyway, only he doesn't let you see that. Man must first turn to God, then only does he see God active everywhere. Now there's another really important point. We keep thinking that the Guru and God will impose their will on us. When people have talked to me in the past about their anxiety about becoming a disciple because they don't want anybody taking over their lives and they want to make their own decisions, my response has always been, no such luck, dream on. You think somebody's actually going to take responsibility for your life if you don't give it to them? And even if you hand it over, do you really think it absolves you of having to participate? Just absolutely not. When you turn to God, God will turn to you. But that's what the Bible says to all those who received him. Receptivity is everything. If you're not receptive, nothing will happen. I remember this man who was at Ananda for a while, and he was a good man. He was very dynamic, and Swami thought he had real potential to be a leader, but his worldly desires took him over. But he was making plans to do something that was spiritually unwise. And he sort of said to Swami, well, if Master doesn't want me to do it, he'll tell me. And Swami made no comment, but after the man left the room, Swami said to me, he said, why would God answer a prayer like that? He said, if you're just saying, well, I'm going to do what I want, and if you don't want me to, stop me. That's not the kind of energy. You have to say, how can I serve? How can I be in tune? How can I learn to love you more? I mean, that's the kind of prayer that's answered. Not, I'm going to do it my way, and if you want to, you can interrupt me. One thing I noticed about Swami Kriyananda that was so interesting, he was exceedingly forthcoming in terms of sharing the teachings, sharing stories of Master. Just, he would, especially in the earlier, especially up until the last decade of his life, he was very outgoing by nature. Even as a young man, before he came on the path, he said when he would travel, he would often, go into a small town in some country or another, and he said by the end of a few days he knew everyone in town. He was just he liked to be involved with people. And when he took on the role of leading Ananda, he would often just hold the whole room for hours on end. Small, large, the dinner party, the satsang, whatever. He would just give of what he knew so freely that you actually had the impression that he was an outgoing person. But whenever we were in an environment where people didn't want what he had to offer, whether when they weren't interested in Master's life or the spiritual teachings or what he really had to give, he would just go into total silence. And if people contradicted him, he would never assert his point of view. He would just let go. Again, you imagine a spiritual teacher being someone who insists, I know what's right and I'm going to tell you. I never saw Swami argue with anyone. If they were interested, he would explain. And that's different than saying, I don't understand that, but what about this point? And it always seemed to me, and how do you reconcile? But if they just wanted to argue or contradict him in such a way that there was no receptivity, he just gave them the point, gave them the floor if necessary. And he would just be non-existent. Because you can't win people to spiritual teaching by arguing them into submission. As Swami said, they'll just go home and make up a whole new set of objections. It's just not the way it works. You have to turn toward God, and then God will turn toward you. And if one feels an absence of God's presence in one's life, one needs to look to oneself. What am I not doing? Where is my consciousness, hour by hour? How am I actually spending my time? What am I listening to on the radio? What am I reading? What am I doing when I go home? What is my conversation? Who am I with? How do I spend my leisure time? And if the sum total of that is not very God-oriented, it's a relationship. And the same rules that apply to any relationship apply to the divine relationship, except that the love is more pure and the relationship is more sensitive. But the same rules apply. Going on, Carroll didn't remain long, as he himself surely realized he wouldn't. Being at Mount Washington, however, proved good for him and must have been an important step in his spiritual evolution. Whoever this man was, he made an impression on Swami and on Master. Swami puts his whole name in here. What was it? Carroll Jolliffe. So whoever he was. The Master stated also sometimes, and these words might have been a good addition to his reply to the guest in the foregoing conversation. The foregoing conversation was about Master had two kinds of disciples, those who went into the monastery and those who didn't. Which were the better disciples? Was sort of the question. The Master stated also sometimes, and these words might have been a good addition to his reply to the guest in the foregoing conversation, had he felt to go into the matter more deeply. Once again, it depends on who's asking the question and how much they want to know, how much Swami or Master would say. So Master said, it is more pleasing to God if you work consciously for him rather than for yourself. If one works in the world and cares only for self and family, it is much more difficult to expand beyond the confines of ego consciousness. Wise is he who views all humanity as his own greater family. Master used to often talk about the trap of what he called us four and no more, which was just, and Swami at other times, or Master actually said it, talked about how a man will justify his selfishness on the basis of doing it for his wife and children. When he couldn't just say he was doing it for himself, because that would sound selfish, he'd say he's doing it for his wife and children. There was that famous story about Valmiki, who was a highway robber and a murderer, and he tried to assault a group of saints, and they suggested to him that it wasn't a very good life that he was living, and he said, well, I'm doing it to support my family. And they said, well, will your family share in the bad karma that you're getting? And he said, well, of course they will. So they said, well, you go and ask them, and if they agree to share in the bad karma, we'll wait here and then you can rob and kill us. So he went to speak to his wife and children and said, I've been doing all these things, bad things, in order to support us, but it won't be just my karma, it's your karma. Of course, you'll share it. Since you're sharing in the fruits of my actions, positive fruits, you'll also share in the negative, won't you? And the wife and children all answered, oh, heavens no, it's your responsibility to support us, and the consequences of your actions remain only with you. So disillusioned, Valmiki went back to the saints, and rather than killing them, he joined them. And the famous story is that he was too evil to pronounce the name of Rama, so they allowed him to make his mantra Mara, which was the name for Satan. But when he said Mara, 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 and it turned into Rama, and that's how he became a great saint. Now he tells the story, so you don't really know what it's all about. But what he's saying here is, even just to say, well, I'm doing it for the sake of my family, if the ego is only expanded that far, that's certainly better than being too selfish even to do that. But he says, wise is he who views all humanity as his own greater family. It's also, Swamiji edits Master's words very exactly and very carefully. Sometimes in the SRF books, and I just have to say it, I can't not say what I'm referring to, they make all his statements emphatic, and they make so many of his statements declarative. So everything is an emphatic declarative sentence. Instead of saying, wise is he who views all humanity, they'll just say, view all humanity as your own family. And at first you don't sort of notice that. But when you read paragraph after paragraph, which is nothing but statements about what you must do, the end effect of that is that you feel that you're just being bombarded with imperatives, which just things that you must do. Whereas the difference between saying view all humanity as your family and wise is he who views all humanity as his family is the difference between freedom and just being ordered about. Now, this isn't the best of all possible examples, but you will find great benefit from meditating an hour every day versus meditate an hour every day. And one is an instruction, and the other is a guideline for the benefit of yourself. One thing I noticed about Swamiji, and somebody editing with just, or maybe even maybe it's not even a recording, or they've taken just notes, you just get the main ideas. And Swami talked often about how distressed he was because so many books that were edited through SRF, he said, didn't sound like Master. That's how he put it. And it was partly, there were other aspects of it, but that was definitely one of the aspects. They said Master was encouraging, Master was supportive, Master was fatherly, Master was sweet. And yes, he was holding for us a high standard. It wasn't that he compromised his ideals, but he understood that the way to win people to his ideals was to embrace them rather than to order them about. And it's subtle, but the effect is profound. Because if you read too many imperatives, feeling like that's all I'm supposed to do, then you just end up with a whole list of things that you can't do. And it's the whole tone shifts radically. And one of the reasons that Swami has done what he has done with Master's words is to preserve that feeling, so that we'll really know what he was like. I mean, and Swami himself set the example, but it's also really important. Even here, if one works in the world and cares only for self and family, it is much more difficult to expand beyond the confines of ego consciousness. Just even that. If you work only for yourself, it's much more difficult. So he's telling you it's going to be a problem for you, instead of saying you're going to be damned to hell if you don't do it. That could be written in other ways. Even if Master said it in slightly different words, the effect of Master's words, I'm not sure that's in this book or somewhere else, where Swami said Swami said, whenever Master instructed us, we always felt encouraged. Even when he scolded us, he said we felt encouraged. He said, it's Satan when the effect is to make you lose hope and to feel discouraged. Isn't that just a simple line in the sand? We also even know that within ourselves. When we feel that our own actions or God speaking to us is taking the hope out of us, we know in that moment that it really isn't God speaking to us. It's Maya speaking to us, because Maya wants us to feel defeated. And Master wants us to win. And Master knows that it just takes time to learn these things. We just don't, we've been deluded for a really long time. And as a consequence, it takes a long time to undo all that conditioning. And so he doesn't really care how long it takes us. He just wants us to win. And it never serves to make people discouraged. It just doesn't work. I mean, what possible good is it for a Master to assert that he's right and that we've made a mistake if the net result of that is that we have less energy to continue? So again, that's why this image of the Guru as the stern, sort of unforgiving, there are people who respond well to that kind of energy, but almost everyone I remember in a certain circumstance in my life, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't motivate myself to do what I needed to do. And so someone tried to help me by explaining to me all the bad things that were going to happen if I didn't just get myself motivated, which just made me more frightened and more paralyzed. And I finally said, it's not that I don't know the consequences of my own actions, it's that I'm very, very nervous. And so because I'm so nervous, I'm confused. I said, you need to help me feel less afraid. And so, fortunately, the person was a good friend, and they tried to make me feel less afraid. And when I felt less afraid, I could move forward. I mean, that's what a friend, that's what a good teacher does. They give you hope that you can do it. I had a friend of mine, not too long ago, I was concerned about whether I could accomplish this thing that I was trying to accomplish. And she said to me, sort of like this, "Oh, Asha, you always get it done. Somehow you always get it done," just like that. And I actually thought for a moment, and I thought, yeah, in fact, it's a kind of a mess, and it's not a straight line, and I'm not always orderly, but yeah, somehow I always get it done. And it was like, what a helpful remark. Just so helpful, because it was a fact, and I had to just stop and think about it. So ever since then, whenever I start feeling, I'm procrastinating, I'm not focused enough, I'm not productive enough, I thought, somehow you'll get it done. I mean, that's what the masters know about us. Swami asked me once when I hadn't started writing, this was 10 years ago, and he really wanted me to get busy writing. He said, "Why haven't you been writing?" He said, "Are you too busy? Are you lazy? Are you afraid?" I said, "All of the above, sir." They said, "Well, I think you really ought to get into it." So I tried. But it was, those were good questions. I don't know. I think it's all of them. All right, any questions or thoughts before we go on? Okay, number 308. What, one may ask, was the Master's mission? As it turns out, this is something I just was saying on Saturday at Spiritual Renewal Week. Oh no, this is something different. No, this is it. I just had this note in another place, and I just found it right here. At Saturday at Spiritual Renewal Week at Ananda Village, I listed out these same 5 points. I was August 2018, Spiritual Renewal Week. What one might ask was the Master's mission. First, it was broadly based. Above all, it was intended for those who, whether married or single, who understood the need to make truth, and therefore God, their priority. His mission also was to establish ideals of equal validity for both householders and renunciates. He came again, and as I've indicated already, to show the underlying oneness of all religions by emphasizing self-realization in God. It was interesting because there was a conversation recently with someone when they were talking about some line, and they said something about sending out a very broad application of Master's teachings. And they were sort of saying it's all Master's teachings, and then they said the phrase only broader. And I started thinking to myself, it was just a casual statement, it's not like their comment was really the point. But I thought, but there's no such thing as only broader, because Master's teaching was to turn every aspect of life toward God. And it's very important in our own way of thinking to realize that everything that he taught can be used to turn that aspect of life toward God. When Swami finished writing the material yogic principles for material success and happiness, which was a course he wrote about 2004 when he first went to India, in response to a doctor's question about how can I make as much money as I need in an honorable way. And the system in India allowed for this doctor to do many things that were unethical because the oversight was not sufficient to prevent him from doing so, or it was just simply assumed that he would. But it hurt him because he was honorable enough to realize that it wasn't in his best interest, but at the same time, he had financial obligations, he had a son, in college overseas, and just he needed the money, and his salary was almost set as if he was going to find ways to supplement it on the side. You know, it gets to be an incredibly complicated, kind of crazy system. When I went to India, I went in 2003, one of the times I went. In 2004, in April, Swami Kriyananda and others had just moved to India from Europe and America, and Ananda was just starting its work in India. And I came over from America in April. I was one of the first visitors, early visitors. I traveled by myself. At that time, each suitcase could weigh 70 pounds. I had 5 70-pound suitcases with me, all by myself, traveling. I had like 4 computers. I had a complete Bose sound system. I had a memory foam double mattress. I mean, I just, on another trip, but it was to Europe, we carried an office chair, people who just wanted things from America. So I had all this stuff, not all of which was entirely legal to bring in. I had it sort of all arranged in ways that I was hoping I'd get away with it. But, I'm coming over for 3 weeks with 5 70-pound suitcases, and I was just this single woman by myself who was clearly naive. So the customs guy gets me engaged with him, and they x-ray it, and they notice all this stuff in there. And at some point, he just tells me it's going to be $200. And I was so naive, I didn't realize I was paying a bribe. I thought I was actually paying the customs fees, which seemed odd to me that he calculated it so casually. But I sort of opened my wallet and just started to hand him the cash. And he said, he got very alarmed. No, like this. He wasn't hiding this from anyone, but that was just too blatant. He said, put it inside your passport and hand me your passport, because I'm so dumb. So I, hand him my passport. He opens my passport and slips the money in. It was like 3 a.m. after 24 hours of travel. And it wasn't until later that I just realized I'd bribed him to get in. I mean, God knows what would have happened if I'd asked him to actually calculate the custom. I probably would still be there. I would probably never have gotten into the country. But he wasn't hiding it. Once when we were traveling in India, I'm not singling India out, I'm just talking about what caused Swami to write these lessons. It was a pilgrimage group, and all of us were from America, but one woman was from Germany. We had gotten multiple entry visas into India for all our American pilgrims, but she'd gotten her own visa entry, and she got a single entry visa, but we went to Nepal. So our whole group, we go to Nepal, then we're coming back in, and 29 of the pilgrims get through, and then she can't get back in because she has a single entry visa. So we're sitting on this side, she's on that side, very informal. It wasn't like here, it's just like, she was just on the other side of the guy. And finally, we just didn't know what to do. So our tour guide walked up and he says, what do you want? The man says, 2 bottles of Johnny Walker Black, from your side of the line. So he went over and bought them and handed them to the guy, and then our girl just comes through, just like this. I mean, it's just the way people are operating, and they don't even think of it as undharmic, except it's chaos. So in the context of this, Swamiji felt to write this Material Success course, which is a great course. I did 50 lessons, 50 classes on it, called Manifesting Through the Power of Yoga. It's on the audio section. I call it a podcast. That's what you call it now. It's on the Palo Alto website. For those of you who are watching and want to watch it, it's not on YouTube. But so he just wrote how to turn everything toward God. How to hire your employees, how to be a good employee, how to do creative advertising, how to sell, how to serve someone, how to help your customers, and just an amazing number of very, very down-to-earth, practical teachings. And Swami said afterwards, after he finished writing the course, which took him a year or more to write, he just said, it was all Master's teachings. He said, I didn't have to create anything. He said, I just took all those principles and applied them to this area of life, and there it was. So it's not like there is no narrow. Master's teachings aren't narrow. They're completely all pervasive in everything that we do, and it's a mindset for us to realize that it's not possible to step into an area of life in which there isn't a self-realization approach to it. I mean, we do think of Kriya, and we think of these things as sort of being the center of it, but there's no boundary. It's center everywhere. Wherever you're standing as a human being, there's going to be a self-realization attitude to have that is actually, it was implied by Master and articulated by Swamiji. And that's basically what Swamiji did. Swami took the heart of what Master was doing, and he said, okay, if you're a creative artist, what would you do? If you're trying to be a businessman, what would you do? If you're trying to educate children, what would you do? If you're trying to be married, what would you do? If you're trying to start a community, what would you do? But he didn't create any of that, and nothing that Swami did was outside of what Master did. He just articulated it. And Swami himself said, far better that someone who was close to Master and really understands his teaching articulates all of this, rather than those who are more distant from it trying to figure it out at a later date. Which is why Swami just sat there and, year after year, and just kind of looked around, what haven't I spoken to? And interestingly, after he wrote the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, the commentary Masters, after he, as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda, so it was Yogananda's commentary, and as remembered by his disciple, he said that was the hub of the wheel. That's how he described it. He said the Gita commentary was the hub of the wheel because it was from everything that was taught there that all of these other principles could be drawn. So he felt that after he finished that, it was sort of settled. And interestingly, the Indira Institute, which is an institute being formed in New Delhi right now as the broadest expression of Master's teachings, the intuition by those who are founding it is that the Bhagavad Gita commentary is the hub of the wheel, because it is. From there, everything else follows. So, he says, his mission, Master's mission, however, like ripples on a pond into which some heavy object has been dropped, spread outward in all directions. That's the perfect way to put it. His mission spreads outward in all directions. I was looking for ideas for the subtitle for the book I've written about Swami Kriyananda, and one of the suggestions was Pebble in the Pond, which might be a little obscure, but still it was a nice thought, because that really what it is. Swami Kriyananda jumped into the pool and made all the ripples go out. For Master came to uplift the whole of society. That's also just something, an avatar comes to change the direction of society as a rule. The avatars usually have an impact that is so far beyond the span of their lifetimes, and in many ways so little discernible during the period of time that they're on Earth. It's only as time passes, and it's like the seeds that they've planted begin to germinate and the pulse begins to ripple out, that we begin to see Buddhism and Christianity being two extraordinary examples of what happened in the lifetime compared to what happened afterwards. So he says Master's mission was to uplift the whole of society. That's really hard to think about, isn't it? We're coming into Dwapara Yuga, and Dwapara Yuga is going to look at life entirely differently than we did in Kali Yuga, and Master was the avatar for Dwapara Yuga, or one of them, but certainly a major one. For example, another reason he came was to introduce into the schools a more balanced system of education, emphasizing spiritual training and character development rather than mundane facts that prepare youngsters for their future careers. That is one of Master's fundamental principles, was to re-educate children. Because until we re-educate children, society will continue in the same way. Now we're so stunningly disbalanced in our education that we're so far off that we can't even tell that we're far off. We're really living in an emperor's new clothes situation, where the stress and the chaos and the overburdening and what's fascinating about it, there's not a shred of evidence anywhere that it helps. All that people do is they learn to be good at it, but it doesn't necessarily make them better at anything else, because they get so disbalanced in their lives, they don't know how to function later. What to speak of spiritual values, but even just basic human values. And also what's so ironic is that because the world is changing so fast, that so much of what you learn is not useful to you. By the time you actually get out and try to have the career for which you've trained, it's like technology has just shifted again. And what you really require is the capacity to keep learning, the capacity to be creative, to work collaboratively with people, and to not lose your center when everything goes crazy around you. But we're dealing with the Emperor's New Clothes now, and it's going to be a while. He came to show people everywhere, in business, in professions, in trade, in the arts, that the inclusion of spiritual principles in whatever they did would enable them to thrive even financially. The inclusion of spiritual principles. He came to show people everywhere, in business, in the professions, in trade, in the arts, that the inclusion of spiritual principles in whatever they did would enable them to thrive, even financially. That's really quite a sentence. And that is the whole point. He says, the underlying oneness of all religions, self-realization in God, including those principles in whatever you do, will enable us to thrive. When I was the spokesperson for our school here, which I was in the first years, this is 25 years ago, when I was able to say it to people, I would explain our educational system is based on the idea that self-realization is actually the goal of life. Ananda as a whole is based on what would a society look like if it was the shared understanding that self-realization were actually the goal. I mean, that's just so interesting to think about. And then you look at whatever enterprises we're involved in this world, and you ask what is the underlying intent behind what we're doing. And just think what it would be like if self-realization were the goal, and how different it would be in such circumstances. Imagine a world in which everybody knows that. Isn't that going to be nice, if we are still reincarnating enough to find it? Because it's going to be a while. All right, let's take a break. During the break, we were having various discussions which seem relevant to put on camera. One of them was the fact that I made reference to the fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, as if everyone would understand that. But it turns out not everyone does know that. Even very well-educated, intelligent people don't necessarily know about it because references change. So the story of The Emperor's New Clothes, just in case you're one of those who doesn't know, is when the king is persuaded by a very feisty salesman that the suit of clothes that he's selling him is so fine that you can neither see it nor feel it. And so the emperor goes out at the head of the parade without a stitch of clothing on because he's persuaded he's wearing this very fine garment, and none of his subjects are willing to point out to him that he is actually stark naked until some little child cries out, "But the emperor has no clothes!" And then everyone realizes that he has no clothes. So I was using that in reference to the, it's global actually. The educational system for children has just moved farther and farther away from real education or real child welfare or real actual proper human development for the things that people actually need in order to be successful in their lives. But we've gotten so caught up in all of these systems that no one seems to realize that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. Because we run a K through 8 school, and also now actually a K through 12 school, kindergarten through 12, even young kindergarten. And for many years I served as the admissions director when the school was small enough that I didn't need a job description. I was just the one who talked to the parents first. But the trend, especially where we live, which is in Palo Alto, almost across the street from Stanford University, is to push academic training down to a lower and lower level, so that 4-year-olds, you have to be ready for kindergarten. By the time you enter kindergarten, you have to have mastered certain things like colors and certain parts of the alphabet and to be kindergarten ready. But there is really no research at all that proves that if you learn when you're 6 what you used to learn when you were 8, that you'll be smarter when you're 18 or more successful when you're 30. There's not an ounce of research that proves that this is true. You'll just be ahead in school, which is not really real life. This is a whole other subject that Master came to change. But the other thing that we were talking about is the fact that as technology advances, and as technology advances so quickly, and even as, whole professions are just vaporized by technology. For many years, when you took photographs, you had film, and then you had the film developed, and there was this little store in town that we used to patronize a lot. It was run by this very nice family, and they developed film. I mean, they had their niche, and it looked like they had their little business to support their family for a long time. Digital cameras. Who could have anticipated? And just one more profession is vaporized. I was reading somebody's campaigning, don't use the self-checkout aisle because all the clerks are now losing their job. And, and there's New York City just ruled strongly against Uber and Lyft coming in, or made certain rules that really prevent that, what they call the ride-sharing industry, because the taxi industry, I mean, what taxi driver ever thought that the app on a phone was going to completely cut out his profession? I mean, these are just a few things, because we're shifting from Kali into Dwapar, and it's just a gigantic change. So when we educate people in any fact or skill-oriented manner, there's absolutely no guarantee that those facts or skills will even be useful. What to speak of lucrative? What is actually required is the human resiliency, the centeredness, the emotional maturity. I mean, what really messes us up, especially in an age of change, is our mental rigidity and our inability to know actually how to learn, our unwillingness to even try to learn, because that would mean we'd have to expose that we don't already know. I mean, these are the qualities that cause us to crash and burn once we're doing something other than just taking tests. And this is what, I mean, even on the most practical level, this is what education has to be. Now, I've mentioned this in other contexts, but because I've been in the sort of front edge of evolving culture, however you want to call it. I've been in California for a long time, and I've been part of Ananda, and before that I was part of I wasn't quite a beatnik because I was just a little young, but then I was almost a hippie, and then I just became an ashramite very early and started meditating. But I've just been on the front edge of a lot of social change just because of my demographic and my temperament. And the things that were radical, when me and my little coterie of people, the wholesome things that were radical, there were other unwholesome things that were radical that fortunately got left behind. Meditation itself, vegetarianism, ecology, organic foods, veganism even, those are just a few of them, were so radical and considered so loony in the late 60s when I started it, but now they're virtually mainstream because consciousness is shifting. And the other reason is, and this is called God Bless America, there's money in it. And money, it's not really that people are greedy. It's that creative business people who are trying to serve look around to see how they can serve. So it's not a negative statement. It's like a creative person comes in, he has to make a living, he wants to be useful to people, and he sees a niche, and he moves into it. And, even when many years ago when we started using neti pots to just run salt water through your nose, which is a tradition that comes out of yoga and came from India, I mean, that was really weird. I started doing that like when I was 20, just because it was all natural to me. Now you go into the drugstore, for a long time, somebody invented a better, easier system for running salt water through your nose, this little squeegee bottle, which is what I've been using now for years. But I saw the actual neti pot. The same company is now putting out the Indian neti pot. This is the CVC. I mean, this is not radical. This is not even a health food store. This is just a drugstore. Because now people just run salt water through their nose. Seems completely trivial compared to how you educate children. But the fact is, if in a free country like America and in a creative country like America, and we're not the only one now, but where creative, free people are there trying to figure out how to serve, things begin to happen. And they begin to happen because the common sense of it becomes obvious. And so I think a lot of children, either who are educated through Education for Life or something like it, which is the system that Swami articulated for Master's teaching, they're either going to insist that there be more schools for their children, either because they went through it themselves or because their own education was so terrible and they know it. It'll happen one way or another. 50 years from now, what is radical today will be common. Just like things that I've already seen change in 50 years, because consciousness is shifting. If this was a downward age, then every new thing would just there would be no new things. People's energy would just be going darker and darker. And those are the lives when we don't try to build. We just go hide and try to preserve. And that's what was happening globally. The secrets of India went up into the Himalayas, pretty much. Some of the early publicity that was written for the Material Success course said, when the British came into India, it was to get the riches of India. And over a few hundred years there, or a century or so, gradually England became the richest country in the world and India became the poorest, because they basically just took all that wealth out of India and took it back to England. Literally, the diamonds, the jewels, everything. And then also essentially destroyed the confidence of the country, which, thank God, we're all coming well out of that. I think today is actually Indian Independence Day, as a matter of fact, so it's a nice day to be talking about it. Tomorrow is it? Well, it's freedom at midnight, so however you count it. But the real wealth of India was the spiritual truth. And they never let the British have it. They just took it up to the mountains and just hid it away, because that was where the real power came from. So that was never lost because it couldn't be taken. But now that the times have changed, and it started with Lahiri Mahashaya. The Lahiri Mahashaya was called up to the high Himalayas by Babaji, and the power of Kriya Yoga was given to him, and then he was sent back. And he was sent back to the city of Varanasi to just sit there and just initiate people, because it's a long process. It happens first on the causal plane, then it has to come onto the astral plane, then it finally comes onto the material plane. So it's step by step, because these changes are. It's a complicated thing, because on one hand, one's soul has no gender and has no nationality and has no ethnicity and has no religion. Judaism has a tenet, and not all Jews believe this, but there's a tenet in Judaism that you have a Jewish soul, that you're eternally Jewish. But self-realization does not support that. Self-realization says, no birth, no death, no caste have I, father, mother have I none, I am infinite spirit. So one simply incarnates where it is appropriate, and all of the ethnicity and culture and religion starts with whatever body you start with, and then you grow up believing that that's who you are. Unless, Swamiji used to tell me, and I didn't believe him until I started traveling, that you can sit in a place like Switzerland or somewhere where there'll be a lot of nations. He said, and you can tell before people speak what nationality they are once you become familiar with it. And that's not based, certain ethnic groups look a certain way, but the ones who don't look a certain way, you can still tell. I thought he was kidding until I actually started to travel, and then I realized how true that was. And then he said, however, then sometimes you meet people who are so themselves you have no idea where they're from. He said you really can't tell. Sometimes even when they speak, you can't tell. He's certainly one of them. Wherever he is, people tended to think he was from there. Even in India, when he would speak Bengali, it would be very confusing because he was so much in the bhav of it, that he seems so much like wherever he is. But, okay, now let me pull all these thoughts back. But a country is an entity that really exists and continues to exist. So if you incarnate into a country or into an ethnic group or a culture or a religious group, you step into all the karma that's associated with it. Because the Jews, for example, have a certain karma, or ethnic minorities in certain places have certain karmas, or black people in America have certain karmas. And so even though you might not have created that karma, when you step into it, you become subject to it. So there's these vibratory fields that are held. And there's advanced astral and causal beings who are in charge of that. Countries have guardian spirits. Swami tells the story of, this is the story that was told to Swami of, at one point the Chinese soldiers invaded India, or the guardian spirit of China told the guardian spirit of India that my boys are getting restless and I'm not going to be able to hold them behind their borders. And so an agreement was made that the Chinese would be allowed to invade, but they would have to stop at a certain latitude, or I guess it would be latitude. And so they invaded and then mysteriously stopped at that point and then just turned around and went home. And it was explained, as Swami told it, because the guardian spirits had made an agreement. A little steam had to be let off, but it wasn't the karma of India to be fully invaded, or it wasn't the karma of China to invade them completely. So they just scuffled for a while and then they went back. I mean, one sees these things happen, but these national environments, these yuga shifts, all of this, these are ongoing vibrations that have their own story, that the soul identifies with, because the acting out of that story is going to be appropriate for the acting out of the particular karma that we have. So we're both uninvolved and completely involved. It's a fascinating reality. So when the masters are shifting the whole consciousness of the planet, which is what started when Babaji called Lahiri to the Himalayas, and then Lahiri carried this Kriya Yoga, and then the agreement was made between them that far from only allowing a narrow spectrum of full renunciates into the Kriya Yoga universe, that Lahiri wanted to keep the door wide open, so that you didn't have to be a monk or a nun, you didn't have to renounce everything, you didn't have to be highly advanced, you just had to be sincere. And that's pretty much, how we followed. And then Master says that gradually the Kriya Yoga science, the scientific practice of self-realization, will awaken people's consciousness to the extent that many things that are commonly done now will be unthinkable at that time. But you can't make that kind of shift all at once, because there's a karmic pattern that people step into that they also hold. So that whole karma has to be shifted slowly. And all you have to do is be aware for one generation. You can do it without participating. I happen to have participated in a certain revolution, that you suddenly see how easily and sort of inexplicably consciousness just bubbles up and everything becomes different. And already now, there's just so many. There's still a pattern. There's two patterns in the world. Our country, America, is watching it especially. Just there's powerful forces that are just completely regressive compared to the real Dwapara Yuga consciousness that's coming in. And that's the real fight. It's between materialism and the belief that the world is only matter and the ego is supreme, and the belief that the world is spirit and that divine realities are supreme. That's the real fight. If the ego is supreme, then I can hate you and I can oppress you and I can go to war with you and I can take from you. If the spirit is supreme and the principles of self-realization, then I can't do any of those things because it hurts me. You're happier when you live correctly. But all those forces are really happening. And so they think the emperor is wearing clothes right now. But even though he isn't. But God will win in the end. The question is only how horrific the struggle will be. Because it is Dwapara Yuga rise. And God will win in the end, even if it were Kali Yuga sinking. Because Jesus came into Kali Yuga sinking. Five centuries passed before it even reached the nadir. But the power that he planted was untouched. It's just had to express through all of that. But the presence of the teachings of Christ through all of that is what actually saved it. And the presence of self-realization through all the spokespeople that God has sent right now in all fields, politics, art, business, and so on. So you see these very God-inspired entrepreneurs and business people and technology innovators who are all being inspired, some consciously, some not consciously, with Dwapara Yuga ideas. And they're beginning to operate in a Dwapara Yuga way, more or less. And then they get deflected. They get poisoned by their own success. Companies like Apple and Google and others that, Hewlett-Packard, that start out with so much dynamic Dwapara Yuga energy, and then they succeed, and they start falling into other kinds of traps, and so it has to keep, nothing is in a straight line. But this is Master's mission, is to influence all of this eventually. And he will succeed. And we're going to get there, but not tonight, about the harvest is plenteous, but we need workers in the field. But we're not going to read that tonight because we finished for tonight. Okay, so tonight I read 307, and I started into 308, but I didn't get very far. Okay?